Ryan, we are putty in your hands to be molded. Except for Joe. Joe is going to be a bit spikier than that.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Talking TWAMPs. Today, we're talking generations. My name is Ryan Walter, and I will be your host today, and I'm joined by my colleagues Joe Bostransky, William Moore, and Jakob Cordes. If you would all want to introduce yourselves and state your majors.
Hi, I'm Joe Bostransky. I'm Ryan's colleague, and I'm an IR major.
Hi, I'm William Moore, also apparently Ryan's colleague, and I am a government and economics major.
My name's Jakob Cordes. I don't know what I would consider myself. Ryan, what are we? I'm an IR major with a focus in Latin America, so, my skills are going to be really useful this time around.
Awesome. I'm a geologist, so you can see I'm in good company with the IR majors here. So today we're going to be talking generations in response to the Parkland shooting and the recent successes, I would say, of the younger generation, which we're going to refer to as the plurals or Generation Z, whichever one you prefer, in actually keeping gun reform on the national mindset and not letting it go away like is typically seen after school shootings like this. According to a report from 538 that was published last week, this sort of response to gun violence and gun reform has much more staying power than in recent times, and so I think that is a big testament to the plurals or Generation Z and their ability to bring it and keep it on the national mindset. And I think that is distinctly because of their individual identity as a generation, which differs from those of the millennials or Gen X. And so we really wanted to talk about how generations work, what their importance is, and I know that we have differing opinions between Joseph and Jakob primarily regarding the importance of generations and if they actually have any form of use or identifying characteristics that make them significant. So why don't we start off with Jakob, and why don't you give us your opinion on, one, the plurals, and two, your opinion on why they think or why you think they've been able to keep gun reform in the national spotlight, and then on generations in as a whole idea.
Yeah, of course. And I don't want to overemphasize the importance that the generation specifically as a category has for kind of driving gun control. Clearly, the change is driven in part by a growth, I think, in not just use of social media, but engagement with it. I think there's a really clear difference between older generations and younger generations in the ability to use social media as an organizing tool and not just as a, kind of platform for basically a soapbox. And I'll say though that the categories of generations, I don't think they're particularly meaningful anymore. I think that.
Would you say that's due to differences between parts of the population in different geographic segments? What do you think defines them differently then?
No, I think the problem is that we tend to think of generations as distinct cohorts of people. We tend to think of it as there is this group of young people in America that belongs to X category, and there's a group of young people in America that belong to, X, Y, and Z category. We put them in different categories. But really, the kind of consistent birth rate that the U.S. has had over the past 50 years means that we have a gradient where clearly there is a difference between a 60-year-old and their political opinions and their engagement with these issues and a 15-year-old. But there's not as much of a difference between a 15-year-old and a 20-year-old. They're going to have similar opinions on the uses of social media, and they're going to have similar levels of engagement with political activism carried out through social media. So I think the distinctions between millennials and Gen Z are just, it makes people feel good to have distinct categories, but those kinds of fine, hair-splitting generational divides aren't meaningful.
Now, I agree with you in principle on this, but I'd like to question your use of the word anymore. Do you really think that there were more serious splits in generational political thinking previously? And if so, what changed?
Yes, I think, well, I don't know about political thinking, but objectively, there have been generations in the past. Oh, yes. If you look at the demographic spike of the late 40s and early 50s, I mean, the baby boomers were as clear an example of a distinct demographic group, a generation that we are going to be able to see. And it is pretty distinct. The baby boomers have a distinct prosperity-driven economic kind of philosophy. And obviously it's not consistent across all of the baby boomer generation, but it is let's say it's a tinge that is particularly placed on baby boomer politics. But again, that's obviously a very particular case where there was a post-war baby boom, and so all of these people were born, I mean, a very large number of people were born into a very specific set of economic circumstances and political circumstances. And I think that could certainly produce a generation that has a particular political consciousness.
Sounds like to me, though, that the only thing that defines the baby boomers as a generation is the fact that they are different, like in economic circumstances than the generation that came before. Because, like, you know, the so-called greatest generation, the one that lived both through the Great Depression and then the Second World War, like, kind of known for, I guess, taking one for the team in a certain way, like, because you had to as a result of the economic hardship of both the economy completely collapsing and then basically a completely command economy for the Second World War. So, like, I don't know necessarily that would then imply that the modern generations, of which we are loving to category, the only thing that's preventing them from being distinct is economic considerations.
Oh, no, that's not what I'm trying to say at all. What I'm saying is that the baby boomers were, by their popular image, kind of given forward in, you know, not only demographic literature, but also popular literature, were given that image. What I'm saying is that generational labels don't really work anymore, that there are so many factors affecting why Gen Z, I'm putting that in air quotes, why younger people
the audience can see that.
Yeah, right. This is a visual medium, right? But there are so many factors affecting why they have a different political leaning that it's no longer meaningful to define them by a generation like it was in the late 40s, early 50s.
Well, I want to say that I don't want to misinterpret what you've said, so correct me if I'm incorrect here, but I do think that as someone who, and this is where we'll get into this part of the conversation later, I consider myself to be part of the millennial generation. I was born in 1997. I'm 20 years old, so I guess I'm technically right on that edge, right on that cusp. And as you said, it's a really good, I think one of your best descriptions of it is a sort of generational gradient rather than block groups. But I can certainly say that there is a lot of bad blood between the baby boomers and the millennials. There are very different political and economic outlooks on life, on the economy, on culture and how to address things, and there seems to be a huge disconnect in between how millennials want to accomplish something and how the baby boomers want to accomplish something and how Generation X wants to accomplish something. If you were to categorize and or group surveys based off of years born and generations, then Gen X is far more a far more negative outlook on life than millennials do. Millennials are notably the happiest generation ever since the greatest generation, since right after World War II and the big boom from the economy. And also you can find that for the first time ever, more people believe that capitalism is not the best form of an economy in the United States. And I think that's due to the rise of millennials and the death of baby boomers. I think that there's a huge disconnect in between the baby boomers and the millennials and even the Gen Xers. I know that I'm distinctly different from my parents in how I look at the economy, how I look at culture, and I know that I have been guilty of blaming the baby boomers and Gen X for a lot of the economic hardships that millennials face. And there's the classic thing of the preceding generation always tells the current generation that they're not going to accomplish much or they're not doing it correctly. But I think that they're, maybe just because I've experienced it firsthand, there's a distinct disconnect between someone, say, my parents' age, who are constantly like, oh, the millennials just want everything handed to them. Gen Z just wants everything handed to them. They're not willing to work for it as much. They expect things to be there rather than trying to work for them and create them on their own. And I think that is a huge difference between someone who's 20 to 30 years old, because that's generally the millennial age, is like 20 to 33, and someone who is 40 to 50 and has kids, has raised kids, and putting them through college and things like that. There's a huge disconnect that I think still proves somewhat that there is validity in grouping together people by generations. Right now, I agree with you, though, that like my sister is 5 years younger than me. She and I are very similar, but we're also very different. She grew up on social media. She grew up on Instagram, all those things. I didn't grow up on it. I still had, flip phones, everything like that. And maybe that's splitting hairs, but there's a distinct difference in how they treat social issues based off of how I've seen them. All of them are very open. They're very amenable to everything. They're very willing to change and move forward and work with everyone and adapt. While someone like me, even though I consider myself, pretty liberal, I'm still, not as willing to, jump in and go. And I haven't been raised on social media, which I think is going to prove to be a very distinct mark in between myself and my sister. Joe, you may go.
I would think that a lot of people make a mistake by creating these large groups and differentiating them by economic or technological differences. I'm going to plop a little New York Times Interactive in the chat, which I'm going to discuss in a second, which I think shows that within what we call the quote-unquote baby boomers, there's such a huge diversion based on what sort of political climate you look at. So we can potentially put this in the show notes, but if you look, for instance, about the difference between people born in 1954 as opposed to 1956 or 1955, are people born just 2 or 3 years later, even today, are significantly more likely to vote Republican than people born earlier, arguably because the people born earlier cast their first, were able to cast their first vote for Johnson, whereas the people born just a few years later had to wait through his administration and cast their first vote for Nixon. I would say that the difference between you and your sister, and because of my unique circumstances, I'd say I'm less plugged into this than y'all are, but I see some of the same differences between me and my sister, is less because of social media and more because you first got your political consciousness, I would surmise, under Bush, whereas they got it under Obama. It's a different idea of what's normal in politics, I would say.
That's definitely
by that first experience.
It's different. It's different than just politics. It's social issues, and my sister and I were. When it was the whole thing was coming, it was on the national mindset. Everyone was talking about transgender rights. I didn't understand it, and I wasn't always, and I wasn't like always willing to be like, okay, this, and this, and I was, 5 years older than my sister. My sister knew from the very beginning and was far more tuned in because of her ability to, see these people on social media, to interact with them, to be behind social activism far more than I ever was. Because she grows up on YouTube, she grows up on Instagram, and that sounds so generalizing. It's something that I hate it when people do it to me, but like I know that my sister spent hours watching YouTube and all of these things, and she's getting all of that content via social media, and social media tends to lean left unless you're very specifically trying to subscribe to the right. So it, I think, is going to show a huge swing towards the left politically because of technology, not because of, a different mindset. Like I was born and I remember Bill Clinton. Like I was born under Clinton's administration. I remember his presidency. I remember some of the things that he stood for. Granted, I was like 4 or 5 when he left. I didn't really care about Bush, or I cared more about Obama because I was older and I was in high school and we started arguing about it. I didn't really care about Bush. I didn't gain a political mindset under it. But my sister and everyone in her generation, all of her friends, they all I mean, they either like to think or they do know that exactly what they want, what they believe. They know their political ideology, and they don't waver from it. And it's always, from my experience, been extremely to the left.
Yeah, and I think what you have to do is you have to say, okay, so there is definitely a divide between you and if you picked a random person who is, 5 years